detailed. Again, you can find all this stuff on the internet as well. So if you need help with anything, if you have any questions about specific tags, how you use them, just do Google, and you will find that. Okay, so we talked last week about HTTP, kind of how the website communication works, how the internet works in general. Now we're going to talk about how we actually create web pages. So we create web pages using 3 different technologies. The first is HTML, or hypertext markup language. This provides the structure and the content of our web page. So the word markup there is kind of important. So think of we have our content, and the HTML is how we mark up that content. It's how we add structure to it, add the content to it. So I don't know what that beeping is. It happened once or twice last semester, or last section too. Hopefully it does not continue. That's going to distract me. So our HTML is kind of how we add structure and meaning to our content. So think of like a newspaper. A newspaper has different sections. Each article has like a title and a byline and a date, and it has paragraphs and images and maybe a footer. If you just had all of that as raw text without any information around it, you wouldn't really know what section is what goes where. So our HTML is kind of how we say, okay, this is a header, this is a paragraph, this is a link, so on and so forth. CSS, or cascading style sheets, is how we provide the styling. So we'll dig into CSS quite a bit as we go along in the class. JavaScript is a scripting language that provides functionality and interactivity. So we'll talk more about that kind of the second half of the semester. So anything you click on, anything you move around, any sort of data processing, any sort of, dealing with APIs and fetching data back and forth, those kinds of dynamic features are all handled via JavaScript. So your web browser downloads the HTML from the server. So when you make a web request and that response comes back, it includes all of your HTML. And then the HTML includes the CSS and the JavaScript. So usually via links to external resources that the browser then will go and download. But the HTML is the complete web page, and it has links to the CSS and the JavaScript inside of it. Okay, dynamic versus static sites. So mostly in this class, we'll be dealing with static sites. So these are just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. They don't really change. They're static on the server. Again, we refer to these as the front end or client side. Dynamic sites is where there's some sort of programming language on the server that will generate the HTML for a given request. Static sites, we're just accessing a file and downloading that file, and that's our page. Whereas a dynamic site, you make a request to the server for, in my case, for my job, zoomride.com/washu or whatever. The server then processes that request. There's some sort of programming language that says, okay, what do I do with this request? Maybe look up some data, do all kinds of stuff, and then it generates the HTML dynamically. So it actually determines what the HTML should look like, usually uses templates and is rendering things on the server, and builds the HTML and then returns it. So like when you go to, if you go to washu.edu, there's not a HTML file somewhere that serves, washu.edu. It's some sort of dynamically generated because there's content management, all kinds of stuff. So, it's not just an HTML file, you're accessing a dynamic site. So again, anything with a login or like e-commerce or discussion forums or content management, that's all going to be dynamic. So to create dynamic sites, you kind of need to know, the static side of things. You need to know the front end, but you kind of combine it with the back end at that point. It's getting a little bit murkier now, and we'll deal with this later in the class when we deal with what we call front-end rendering or client-side rendering like React, where we're actually fetching data, and the JavaScript is adjusting our page. It kind of starts to blur the lines a little bit between static and dynamic. But for the sake of this class, we're accessing files on a server. We're not accessing, server-side rendered HTML. So if you're dealing with PHP or ASP.NET or Java, that's all dynamically generated. One thing we need to talk about is WYSIWYG site builders. So WYSIWYG stands for what you see is what you get. It gives you kind of a drag and drop interface where you can kind of type and draw and create the website how you want it to look. So there's different ways to do it. There's software like a Dreamweaver. There's some other software, and kind of that's probably a little more old school. Or stuff on the web, Wix.com, Squarespace, those kinds of tools. They provide really powerful platform where you can create a website purely through a click, drag and drop type interface. So there's a lot of pros to this. It's easy and anyone can do it, right? You don't have to have any technical knowledge. You don't have to take computer science courses at WashU to be able to create a Wix.com website. My mom could probably make one if she really wanted to. I will recommend Wix or Squarespace to people that ask me, hey, I want to make a website for my band. I don't have any money to pay someone. I don't want to learn HTML. How do I make a website? Well, just go to Wix.com and it's really easy. You can do it. So they'll do that. There also are plugins for dynamic features. I have a buddy who built a full e-commerce website on Wix or Squarespace, one of the two. He set it up. It took credit card payments. Real simple to set up. You can create blogs, stuff like that. There are lots of cons. It's pretty limited. They've created kind of a walled garden, kind of a sandboxed, solution for you. And within the confines of what they provide for you, you can do all kinds of stuff, but you're still limited by what they provide. You can't, go too out of the box. It also doesn't generate very clean code. Again, if you use Wix or Squarespace for your assignments in this class, the TAs and myself are going to be able to tell very quickly because it's really obvious, because the HTML is really crazy, the CSS is crazy, because again, you're dragging and dropping stuff, so it's, dealing with all kinds of, it has to do all kinds of crazy CSS to make all that happen. So typically it doesn't generate very clean code. Again, the biggest con is just how limited it is. There's only so much you can do. Here's kind of what Wix looks like. Again, if you want to change this text, you can just click on it and change it, and you'll see it reflected as you change it. Pretty powerful. Dreamweaver, at least, Dreamweaver is kind of a nice tool. It will show you your HTML. It shows you your DOM over here. Shows you all your files. It gives you, some more developer-oriented tools. I know developers that will use stuff like Dreamweaver. It gives you a nice preview of what's going on. It can be kind of useful. There's also content management systems that are really popular. So again, software that runs on the web server, it gives you a system to manage your content that's tailored to managing content. So something like WordPress, something like that, you can, managing a blog, you can see the list of your blog posts, you can click on one, you can edit your title, you can, edit your content, highlight stuff and click bold. Really simple, really focused on your content. You can usually add a theme, and then it generates the HTML for you. So you're not writing HTML typically. It builds the HTML for you. So examples of WordPress, Drupal, etc. Again, lots of pros. Really easy to manage content. Again, really good for just dealing with content. I've done a lot of professional work on WordPress and Drupal. They're really nice for people that want to blog, but they don't want to build a website. I can build a website using WordPress, and then all they have to do is log into WordPress, and they can manage the content. Once I'm done building the site, I don't really have to touch it again, and they can write their blog posts and publish stuff and delete stuff and edit stuff, and I never have to worry about it again. That's kind of a nice setup for people that want a website. They want to be able to manage the content, but they don't have the technical skills to actually, build the website itself. Again, and really a lot easier to edit your blog posts, in WordPress than it is in your HTML, right? It'd be kind of a pain to pull up an HTML file and write HTML. So they're really good at managing content. You can deal with themes. You can even buy some really high quality themes that are pretty plug and play. Make it look however you want. You can add plugins, again, for functionality. E-commerce, I've done some e-commerce WordPress sites, stuff like that. It's pretty simple to do. Some cons, it can be difficult to set up, especially if you're hosting it yourself. You can run all sorts of crazy stuff. WordPress is kind of a beast. It can be really hard to deal with. And again, it's limiting in features. There's only so much you can do with it. You've got restrictions. And if you try and break out of that, you can. With WordPress and Drupal, you can get under the hood and you can actually edit the PHP files, or you can build, your own plugins. You can edit the templates, but it gets real hairy because, again, it's a walled garden approach. They've created the system that should be able to work for everyone, But once you try and do something outside that, it starts to get really hard. So if you ever have a job that's like super customized WordPress, don't take it because it's really hard. So again, this is kind of what editing a blog post would look like in WordPress. You've got a title, you've got this visual editor. It looks like Microsoft Word, right? It's really easy, simple to use. You can add, change the format of what you want. Really nice for certain applications. So now that I've sold you on these great tools for building websites really easy, why are we learning HTML, etc. The main reason is that all of these boil down to HTML and CSS and JavaScript, right? Like WordPress, in the end of the day, it's generating HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Wix.com is building HTML. It has to be using that behind the scenes to use, to work on the web. So understanding this underlying technology, one, helps us use these tools more effectively. If you know HTML and CSS, you can do a lot more customization within those walled gardens because you can, add your own CSS, etc. You can do a lot of customization with WordPress, etc. You can also understand their limitations a little better. I feel like I'm in a pretty good, place to recommend. Like when someone talks to me about, a web project, I can kind of understand. Okay, yeah, you should really have this custom built by someone, or WordPress will work for you because your needs are limited enough that WordPress will do the job. Also, these tools are always changing. There's always new ones. Hopefully, you guys can build the next Wix.com that works even better and has more flexibility, right? Like, we kind of have to understand the underlying technology if we're going to be able to build new tools. Wix isn't going to be around forever. HTML probably will be, or it'll probably outlast it for sure. So that's why we're kind of digging in under the hood and kind of examining the underlying technology. Okay, so HTML. HTML is an evolving specification. It was invented in 1989 by a guy named Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. If you've ever heard of CERN, it's a particle accelerator facility in Switzerland. It's kind of interesting to me that, he's a scientist. It was created by scientists in the very, very early days of the internet when they didn't really have a good protocol for exchanging information over the internet. They had ways to connect to computers, through the internet, but they didn't really have a good way to exchange data. These scientists were always writing research papers. They were, doing research. They had data they needed to be able to share with one another. So HTML is kind of the agreed specification they came up with of how to exchange that data between different academics. The early internet was primarily, research institutions and universities because they needed to be able to share data. They needed to be able to talk to each other because they were always doing, research, and they need to be able to talk. So it's really fascinating. That's kind of where it came from. The HTML specification is maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C, which is a bunch of different industry leaders. Again, it's important to understand HTML is a specification. It's not like a technology really on its own. The W3C publishes papers, really long, detailed papers that explain what HTML is and how it works and what all the tags are. The W3C doesn't actually, write any software for HTML. It's up to the browsers to implement the specification, right? So the browsers write the software that takes the HTML and per the spec, renders it how it should be. So it's always evolving. It started off, HTML1. HTML4 is kind of the most recent major version, which was finalized around 1999. That's still probably primary in use, but HTML5 has been finalized for 2 to 3 years now. They have a whole process for, there's proposals for new versions and what kinds of features and, what new elements they should add, what stuff they should remove, and then everyone kind of agrees, and then they finalize it, and then they publish it. So HTML5 has been ready. Browsers are still kind of catching up. Most HTML5 features are pretty safe to implement because all browsers support them at this point. Again, older IE still struggles a little bit with some HTML5 elements. But for the most part, we can write HTML5 now. It's like 99% adopted at this point. So pretty safe. I don't really know what's next. I haven't done much research on the next version of HTML or what kinds of stuff they're considering. But the W3C's website's there if you're interested in reading it. If you have, questions about any of these elements we talk about and you really want to understand the, nuts and bolts of how it's supposed to work, look up the specification. It's really interesting to read because they usually explain why they made certain decisions and why things work the way they do. So again, because HTML has evolved, the doc type is the way that we indicate which version of HTML the browser should use. So we have to indicate the version of HTML that we're writing so that it knows how to render it. HTML5 has really simplified the doc type. All you have to do is doc type HTML. So this line right here should be the very first thing in your HTML file before any spaces, before any new lines. The very, very first thing is this doc type HTML. The HTML4 doc type looked like this. So if you ever see this at the beginning of an HTML page, you know it's using HTML4. Again, there was a lot more options. There were like loose and strict versions of the standard you could choose from. Yeah, question?
If you leave out the doc type, will the browser still infer?
Yeah, the browser usually will infer, and because most websites use HTML, right? So usually like, all right, this is probably HTML. But you're not going to be in spec. And sometimes they might throw an error or something like that. So yeah, usually it still works, but you really should always have the doc type there. Okay, any other questions? Okay, comments in HTML. If you've taken other computer science classes, you're probably familiar with comments. We use them the same way in HTML. You want to add them to your code. Usually want to explain portions of your code to your future self or other future developers to kind of, if you're looking back or adding something. You can use them to separate different sections or just make a note about why you did something that you did. I can't tell you how many times I've found comments in code I'm working on that's like, this is broken. It's like, okay, great. Why is it broken? How is it broken? It's not a very helpful comment. So try and be pretty descriptive when you need to add comments. One note is that comments can be seen by doing view source. So if you view source on the browser, you can see the HTML for that page, and you will see the comments in there, which can be interesting. You can see comments that developers left in their HTML. But it's really important not to include any sort of sensitive information in a comment. That's really, really bad practice. That's the first thing any hacker looks for when they're trying to break into a website or a server, is they check the comments and see if there's anything interesting in there. There's one of the recent, I want to say the Equifax hack that happened like 6 months ago or something, but it may have been something else. But one of them did have to do with comments. They were able to find like a default password or something in a comment, and were able to get in that way. So don't put anything sensitive in your comments. Again, you can comment out a line of code if you want to adjust it or temporarily remove it. Most code editors, you'll use like command/ on a Mac or control/. You can like highlight some code and hit that shortcut and it will comment it out for you. Nice. Okay, so HTML, what is it? It's a language used to describe a structure of a web page. It's composed of elements that include an opening tag and a closing tag. And the closing tag is identified by a slash at the beginning. So this whole thing is our HTML element. And it begins with an opening tag. That is the tag name. Again, we see these angle brackets that kind of wrap the tag name. The contents go in between the opening and closing tag. So this is our text. This is our data, our paragraph text, our heading, whatever it is. The contents go in between the tags. And then we have our closing tag that starts with a slash. So the whole thing's the element. The tags are the beginning and the end. So ultimately, our web pages are just made up of all of these elements, various types of elements. We've got like headings and paragraphs and lists. They often will contain a hierarchy of information. So when we're working with our HTML, we really want to think about how our data is structured, how our page is structured, what the hierarchy is. So what our headings are, what our subheadings are, lists, you can have nested lists. So again, the HTML tags go around our content. Again, it's like markup that's, you could think of just, pure text and then you're adding, information to it to provide that structure. We can also nest elements within each other. So you can have a paragraph that has a link inside of it or whatever, lists with nested lists. So, elements can be contained inside of each other. So some really important elements to talk about. First, we have our HTML element or our HTML tag, which wraps the entire web page. So right after the doc type should come your HTML tag, and that wraps everything. Inside of the HTML tag, the first thing we have is our head, which provides some meta information about the page. The head tag doesn't actually get displayed on the page by the browser. It just kind of provides some additional information. And then the title tag goes inside the head tag, and it provides a title for our page, which will show up in the title bar. So up there at the top, in the top of the window where it says CSE204 Electro 2, that's the title tag. That's what how we indicate what goes there is through the title tag. Or it'll show up like on the tab or something like that if you're using tabs. So after the closing head tag, we have our body, which contains everything that actually exists in the browser window. So the body is what will actually show up visually. All these tags are required, so you have to have a head tag, even if all it has is a title. There's other tags that can go in our head, but the title is required. So all 4 of those tags are required tags. Again, sometimes you can leave it off and it still will work, but in order to meet the HTML specification, we really should include those. Yeah, question?
The title can be a blank string, right?
Yeah, it can be. You can't have a blank title.
Be there as an element.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah, if you really don't have a title or nothing makes sense, then yeah, it can be blank. So here's a quick example of a super basic HTML page. This is missing the doc type. I left that off for some reason, but we've got our HTML tag that wraps the entire thing, followed by the head tag, which has a title inside of it. Then our body that has the body of our page, what will actually show up in the window, and then we close our body. A quick note. Really useful to do this kind of indentation. So whenever you have tags that are inside of other tags, it's really, really good to indent them to indicate, what level they're at. I can't tell you how many times, in this class, students have come up and they've got some sort of problem with their HTML. So, okay, pull up your HTML, let's take a look, and everything's, along the left, and tags are mixed together, and it's like, okay, well, you're going to have to fix your indentation first so that we can see your code and kind of understand the structure of it. So really, really helps if you have a really, structured indentation. It doesn't really matter what the indentation is. You can have this all on one line if you want. It will work. It's just for us, it's just for you as a developer to reference. So typically anything, that is a sub tag or a sub element gets indented. Okay, element attributes. So attributes are a way to provide some additional information about the contents of an element. They appear only on the opening tag, and they have a name and a value. And the value is wrapped in quotes, and we use the equal to indicate. Usually attributes have no practical effect. Some of them will. But typically they're used by our CSS or our JavaScript to interact with those elements, to identify them. We use like ID or class for that. But there are some ways that they'll modify the behavior or the appearance sometimes. So again, here's an example. We've got our tag name. Then we've got attribute name with a value. So again, this could be like ID or class. There's a lot of options here that we'll go over as we start looking at tags, and then we'll provide the value. Only on the opening tag, it's a way of providing some sort of additional information. So here's an example with some attributes. Again, also a nice thing to point out, if you're using actual code editor, it should provide some sort of coloring for you to kind of help you see these specific parts. So if you're just using like TextPad or something, it may not do this, but if you're using Atom or something like that, it usually will kind of help visually break out these different parts for you. So in this case, our attributes here are either yellow or orange or blue. So this is a style attribute. I'm showing this here as an example, but also kind of to show that you shouldn't really use style attributes. You may have for your first assignment in the extra credit if you found that. There's better ways to provide styling. We'll talk about CSS, which is a lot better than just doing style attributes. This is even going to be deprecated at some point if it's not already in HTML5. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we shouldn't really use the style attribute anymore. But if you wanted to, it's an example of an attribute you can use. There's also ID and class that we'll talk about later on. Images, we've got like a source that provides the URL to the image. Those are all attributes. You can also have multiple attributes. You can just separate them with a space. So you've got the equals and the quotes, then a space between multiple attributes. Okay, view source will allow you to see the HTML of any website in your browser. So it's different ways to pull that up in different browsers. Developer tools is even better. It gives you a really powerful interactive tool to kind of look at the different elements on your page. Lets you see the CSS. You can change the CSS and get live updates. You can even add the HTML as you go. You can like move stuff around. Really, really great. We didn't have this when I first started doing web development, like 10 years ago even, 15 years ago when I was learning it. It almost feels like cheating now. It's really, really nice. I use it all the time. I do most of my active development in the inspector even because it's so easy to add new CSS rules and modify stuff and see it live in real time. And then once I'm happy with how it looks, I'll copy the CSS rules over or whatever. But really, really great tool. If you're not using developer tools, you really should. It will help you solve lots of problems. Usually you can the way I get to it is right click on any element on your page and click inspect element. It'll open developer tools with that element highlighted for you. So super nice. Here's what it looks like. So again, you can see all of your HTML here. You can choose elements. It'll usually highlight that element on the page for you, which is really nice. Show you the dimensions. Over here, you can see the styles. So these are all the different styles associated with the element. You can click on these and change them. Super nice. It gets crazy. You can have it, add a hover state or something like that. Really, really nice. So developer tools, very powerful. Here's another example of HTML for some reason. I'm going to delete that slide. Okay, so first type of elements we'll talk about are text elements, which are kind of the most basic elements that we have. They provide just some structure to the text on our page. All of the elements inside of text elements should only be text. So, if you got a paragraph, you can have some other elements in there, but generally it's just text inside there. If you have a heading, it should only be text inside that element. The browsers by default provide some really minimal styling for text elements, but that'll be changed via CSS. So first we've got headings. So there's 6 levels of headings in HTML, so H1 through H6. The browser by default will make H1s the biggest and they get smaller as the heading level increases. So H1's largest, H6 is the smallest. You really should have your headings be structured. So you don't want to have an H2 unless it's a subheading from an H1, right? So that's a best practice. It's within the HTML spec. It's kind of how you're really supposed to, structure your page. Because you wouldn't have like a, Word document that has a subheading if there's not a, main heading somewhere under it. So really important that we think that way because, it's really common to just choose the heading level that represents the size that you want. So you say, oh, that H1's too big, I'll make it an H3 so it'll be smaller. We don't want to think that way with our HTML because we can change the size of things in our CSS. We want to think about the structure of our content, and so we shouldn't have subheadings that aren't under a main heading somewhere. That's why there's only 6 of them, because that's generally don't have more than 6 levels of subheadings. But you may make them really small or really big or however you want to do it. So again, think about the structure, headings and subheadings. Make sure you really think about that. It makes a big difference in the structure of your page. Paragraphs are important. So P tags wrap individual paragraphs of text. They'll be separated by a line break and some margin will separate them. So that's kind of what we'll generally use for paragraphs. Bold and italic, you use the B tag or the I tag. I don't really recommend that you use these anymore except for some really certain circumstances. We'll talk about that in a second. There's a better option. But they still exist. I think they're being deprecated as well in HTML5 at some point. Most browsers will still support them, but you really should move away from using B and I. You can do superscript or subscript. White space is important to talk about. So web browsers will collapse any white space in your HTML page. So if you add a line break in your HTML between some paragraphs or something, it will all get condensed and just be treated as one space. Same with like multiple spaces inside a sentence. If you say, oh, I want these sentences to be separated and hit spacebar a bunch of times, your browser doesn't care. It combines all of that and will be treated as one space. So there's a couple things we can do. One, just using the paragraph tag, because each paragraph gets a new line. That's kind of the best way to do it. We can also use BR or break tags to manually insert a new line. You should do this really sparingly, though. In fact, the goal should be to never use break tags, because it's kind of a manual way of doing it that typically indicates something about your structure or your CSS is wrong if you're having to use break tags. You should definitely never use multiple break tags to create a big space on your page. If you're doing that, you're doing something very, very wrong. Because we'll do that with CSS. With CSS, we can add padding, we can space things out, we can do whatever. So there's very few instances where you really have to use a break tag. And HR has a little bit more merit. It inserts a line break as well as a horizontal line. So we can use that to separate different sections or something like that. So again, it's a little bit more useful than a break tag. It's not just forcing a line break. It's actually providing some sort of structural element with a big horizontal line. Both of these tags are what are known as empty elements or self-closing tags. So it's got the tag name, but then you notice it just has a slash here at the end, and it doesn't have a closing tag along with it. This is because there's no text content that goes inside of the tag, right? It doesn't really need an opening and a closing tag because there's nothing to go in between the tags. It's just kind of an empty element. It stays on its own. There's some other examples of empty elements that we'll see as we go. Okay, so semantic elements. These are intended not to be structural necessarily, but they add some sort of meaning or some sort of context to our content. So they may have some default styling, but we'll customize it further with CSS. The primary purpose of elements is not style. They should only be used when they're enhancing the meaning of our content. So, for example, if you want, if you've got a heading and you want it to be bold, don't just use a strong tag, which we'll talk about, but you'd use an actual heading tag to indicate it's a heading. So again, we're not thinking about the style, we're thinking about the structure, and in the case of these semantic elements, the meaning of the content. So there's some examples we'll go over. Some of these. So strong and emphasis are the replacements for bold and italic. So if you think about it, strong and emphasis, those are more meaningful terms to describe our content than just bold or italic. Bold and italic reference the style, the way it should appear. We're moving away from having our HTML indicate the style. We want our HTML to purely be structure and meaning, and we'll deal with style in CSS. So strong typically is rendered as bold, but again, there's different ways that you can interpret strong. So you may style strong tags as a different color or a different size or some other way of indicating that they should be stronger rather than just bold. So by default, it's bold, same as the bold tag. But by using a more generic term and a more meaningful term, it's a better way to use it. Emphasis by default will be italics. Again, it can be used to kind of indicate what words emphasis should be placed on, where it kind of subtly changes the meaning of a sentence. So again, same as I. You can still use bold and italic if there purely is no meaning related to it. But typically you want to be adding meaning with these tags. Quotations are another type of semantic tag. So by default these don't actually affect the style or the display at all. They're just ways of providing some more context around our content. So we can use block quotes for longer quotes that may take an entire paragraph or even multiple paragraphs. And you still may need to use the P tag inside of a block quote to indicate there are multiple paragraphs. We can also use Q for shorter quotes that sit in line with a paragraph. So you've got a paragraph and then you've got a quote inside that paragraph and it doesn't need to be broken out. You can just use the Q tag for that. You can also use the cite attribute to provide a URL with some context or some more information for that quote. So here's an example using block quote. It's got a cite attribute with the Wikipedia URL. Where we got it from, and then our quote itself is wrapped in a paragraph tag so that it gets a new line we could have multiple paragraphs there if we wanted to. So that's how you use block quote. Questions so far? Okay. So these are a little bit less commonly used, but they do exist. So we can use ABVR for abbreviations. Typically, if you hover over the abbreviation, whatever you put in the title attribute will pop up as a tooltip to give you what the full term is. You can use cite to list a reference. So typically it's rendered in italics. So I'll use cite every once in a while if I've got some paragraphs of text or something and I've got some sort of reference that I want to link to. Instead of just putting a plain link, you can use the cite to indicate that this link is a reference that goes along with the material or goes along with the paragraphs you just had. You can also use DFN if you're providing a definition of a term. So think of like a textbook and how keywords will be bold in the sentence where the definition is provided. You can use DFN to indicate that, hey, I'm giving a definition of a term in this sentence. So it's usually like within a paragraph or something, you'll have the DFN around the tag, around the term. Some browsers will italicize them. Like Firefox, I think, italicizes DFN tags, but Chrome and Safari don't. So again, that's something where the HTML specification probably doesn't indicate whether or not it's supposed to be italicized. So the browsers kind of chose what they should do based on their opinion, basically. But again, we can style it however we want in CSS. Here's a couple of examples. I'll really talk about address, which we can use to wrap some sort of address. It can be a physical address, a phone number, a web URL, or an email address. Again, it doesn't provide any style changes. It doesn't really do anything for the structure. It's just semantics saying, okay, this content is an address to something. So I'll use that quite a bit just to kind of as a way to indicate that this is an address. There's insert and delete, which we'll rarely use. Strike through, we might use sometimes. It just draws a line through the content, which can be used to show something's been deleted or something like that. Okay, questions so far? Been talking for a long time. My throat's gonna dry. Yeah.
When you create the sites, when you click on it, does it take you to them, or do you need to create them like a
Oh, that's a good question. I think you still have to add a link inside of it. Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I think if it's like a site in like a block quote, I think maybe if you like hover over it, it'll show you what the citation is, but it doesn't link it by default. But I think if you use this site, I think you still have to add an A inside of it. Because you might, it might be like a book or something. It doesn't have a link, but you can add a link tag in there as well. It's a good question. Same goes for address. It doesn't actually link anything. You'd have to use a link tag inside there. On Thursday when I got home, I could like barely talk. I hadn't like talked much in the summer and talked for 3 hours straight. Okay, lists. So several different types of lists we can do in HTML. We've got ordered lists where each item in the list begins with a number sequentially. So like recipe steps or table of contents we would use ordered list for. So it's called ordered list, not like numbered list, and that's because we can change the type of numbering in CSS. So you could change it from numbers to Roman numerals or something like that. It's just that it's ordered. We also have unordered lists, so like bullet points, something where you don't need to indicate the number necessarily. Kind of like this, bullet list here. We don't care that it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's just they're bullets. We also have definition lists, which are terms along with their definition, so it's a list of terms. And one note too, we can nest lists inside of each other. So you may have an ordered list where each item of the ordered list has an unordered list inside of it, or another ordered list inside of it. Have sub-bullet points, stuff like that. So here's how we do ordered lists. We use the OL tag, which stands for ordered list. Inside it has list items, or LI, and then we close our ordered list once we're done with it. So you notice I don't have like 1 and 2 on these, but the browser by default will add the numbers for us. So it'll calculate which number it is and it'll add that number. And again, you can change the format it uses, whether or not there's a period after it, that kind of stuff with CSS. Unordered lists look very similar, except instead of OL, we use UL for unordered lists. And instead of numbers, we get bullet points. Again, we can change the type of bullet points. By default, it's these round, solid ones, but you can have, squares or hollow circles. You can even add your own images if you want, your own custom type of bullet. In CSS, you can add an image that it'll use for those bullets. Definition lists are a little bit different. We use DL for definition list. DT wraps the term, and then the definition follows the DT using a DD to provide the dictionary definition. So you kind of have to have these like couplets, and you can have multiple of them. You can have them out of order if you want. I've seen some people do that, like they'll list several DTs and then they'll list several DDs. You can do that. I like to kind of keep them linked, but it just kind of depends. I think keeping them next to each other is better for screen readers because again, the screen reader is going to get here. It knows this is a definition list. And so it's going to read the term followed by the definition. So again, that's where we have to think about how a screen reader is going to, read this content. Definition lists are a really good example too of why we care about using the proper types of elements. So this is what this list looks like. We could just do this with, paragraph tags or something, and add some spacing, and this could each just be a paragraph. But when a screen reader reads it, it's just going to read HTML, hypertext markup language, CSS, cascading style sheets. It doesn't get any contextual information about that data. But by using a definition list, now it's going to read it, and it's going to tell the person listening to the content, okay, this is a definition list. The term HTML has the definition, hypertext markup language. So it kind of gives them that contextual information about what's going on, helps it, to kind of make more sense. And they may do different things as well. Typically, the definition is indented a little bit by default by the browser as well. We can change that. You can adjust it in your CSS, but by default, that's what they'll do. Okay, links. So we use the A element to create links. The content in between the opening A tag and the closing A tag is the clickable part of the link. So whatever the user sees, they can click on. We use an href attribute to indicate the page the link should go to. They're by default style is blue and underlined. They'll turn purple once they've been clicked, but we can change all of that in CSS. One thing to talk about a little bit is absolute URLs and relative URLs. So an absolute URL contains the full web address. So it has the HTTP and the domain and the full page that we're going to. So typically we use that for like external links that are going to a different website. We'll use the full absolute URL. A relative URL is relative to the current page you're on and the current domain that you're on as well. So you'll see a link where it's just the href is aboutus.html. So say you're on washu.edu/home.html and you click on this link, it's going to take you to washu.edu/aboutus.html. So we'll use those relative links for links within the same website, just different pages on that same website. There's a couple of tricks we can do with relative URLs as well. If you just link to the file name, it's going to be a page within the same folder. But we can also traverse directories. So you could do like, you could add a subfolder. We had like subpages/aboutus. That'll go into a different folder. Or you can use .. to go up a level in your folder directory. So say you're in subpages/ something.html, you can go to link to .. /aboutus, and it'll go from the subpages up a level in your folder directory to a different file. You can also chain multiple .. together. You can do like .. / .. to go 2 levels up. There's also mail to links. So they'll open the user's email program and fill out an email to address with the email address you provide. So you use the href for that, and you do mail to : and then provide the email address. I typically try to be pretty careful when I use these because if like I don't use the default mail app on my Mac, like the mail app I use Gmail. So anytime I click these links, it like opens up the mail app, which I don't really have configured, and there's usually a ton of emails open from other times I've clicked these links. So I find that really annoying because I have to quit the app, I have to go back to my browser, I have to copy it. So usually what I do is if I use a mail to link, I'll at least put the email address in the actual text of the link as well. So the user can just highlight it and copy it if they want. Usually you can like right click and click copy email or something like that. But typically instead of just saying email Craig, I'll actually just put the email address in there as well. So that's just me. I run into that a lot. I find it very annoying, so I try to be nice to other people and think about that. Again, sometimes you just don't even need to use the mail to because not everyone uses it. You can also force something to open in a new tab. So you use the target attribute. So we've got our href, and then we've got our target equals, and you do underscore blank, which indicates to open in a new blank tab. There's a few other options you can put in there, but underscore blank is the main one that we'll use. You can also use a pound sign at the end of an href to link to a specific ID element on the page. We'll talk about ID elements on Thursday, but you can, specify, indicate a certain part of your page has a certain ID. So you could say like, you could have just the pound sign about us, and it'll jump to that part of the current page you're on. So that's really nice. We'll see that a lot. Different menus will just jump to different parts of the page. You could also do an absolute URL, google.com pound sign about us, and it'll jump to google.com, and it'll jump to that part of the page. So that's kind of a useful way to link to a really specific location. I'll use that a lot, like at work, like we have documentation pages and they'll have, IDs and, if I'm telling somebody about something, it may be a long page, but if I only need them to read one paragraph, I'll send them a link with that ID to the paragraph to it. Some stuff like GitHub, I think, will even show you a little link icon on each heading and you can copy it. Yeah, question?
What is the underscore blank?
That's to make it open in a new page or a new tab.
Are there other options?
There are some. You can even have named windows. So you could you could say like target equals window 1, 2, 3. It's not used as much anymore, but it used to be where if you had you wanted to open a certain window and then open new links in that window as well, you can name it. But underscore blank's pretty much all we ever use. So, any other questions? Okay. Yeah.
What if you because you said Windows in your response, I was curious. That thing blank creates the page in a new tab. What if I want to do it in a new window?
Yeah, I think it's underscore new that forces a new window. The problem is a lot of browsers block that. Yeah, because pop-ups. So it used to be even underscore blank, I think, would open a new window. But yeah, most browsers now don't let you open a new tab or a new window because of pop-ups. So they've locked that down. That's a good question, though. And yeah, if you research it, there's a couple other options you can do there. But typically, blank is what we'll use to do new tabs. Okay, so we can use image or IMG elements to include images. They're empty elements. There's no content or text inside of them. So they're self-closing. They have a little slash at the end rather than an opening and closing tag. They've got a source attribute to give the URL to the image. It can be relative or absolute. So it could be an image you've got within your files of your website, and you can link to it that way. Or you can link to an image on a different website. There's also a required attribute of alt, which provides a description of the image. So it's used for a couple things. It's used for screen readers, so that's the most important use. So a screen reader, they're not smart enough yet to do AI on an image and then find a description of the image or something. So you have to provide some contextual information about what that image is, so that screen reader users can understand a little bit about what's going on there. So you want to be pretty descriptive in your alt tags. You don't want to just say, this is an image. You want to say what it's an image of and why it's there. It also, I don't think I mentioned it here. Oh yeah, if the image is no longer accessible. So if the image doesn't load for some reason, if the file's been deleted or the page it's hosted on is down, it'll show the alt text instead of the image. So again, that can be useful as well, just to make sure that even if the image is gone, the users understand why that big space is there. I've seen that a lot for like, I don't know, like Twitter or something like that. If the profile image doesn't load, it'll still put the name there, so you can say, okay, that's who it is that's tweeting, even though you don't see the image. Stuff like that. There's also an optional attribute of title, which will provide a tooltip when you mouse over. So when you hover over an image, a little tooltip will pop up. So you can use title attribute to provide that. Also, you can use figure and fig caption, which are HTML5 elements that will wrap around an image and provide a caption as well. That's a really handy thing I like to do when there's some sort of caption that goes with the image, because then you can move the entire figure around, and it'll move the image along with its caption. So that's kind of nice. So here's an example of image. So first we've got just a plain image. We've got a relative URL to the images directory in our website. We provide some alt text. This isn't very descriptive. You should probably say it. You can be, use your judgment on how descriptive you need to be. If this is a bird picture that's just, for fun, or it's just, kind of I don't know, it's not important to the content, then yeah, you could just say bird picture in your alt text. But say this is a website about different types of birds, we might want to include that information then, because it's probably important. We'll probably have a section about wrens, and so we want to say this is a male wren or something like that in our description. So be as descriptive as you need to, depending on what your content is. Here's an example of using figure as well. So we've got the figure element, and inside of it is our image, and then our fig caption provides the caption. And there's an example where you may need to use a BR. There's other ways to avoid it. You could set these to like display block or something in your CSS, but by default, images and fig captions are inline, so you'll have the image and then the caption will be next to it, but if you want the caption on a new line, you might use a break tag for that. Yeah, question?
I don't exactly understand the keyword alt. Is it just for when people are looking at your code and they want to know what this is referring to?
No, it's the screen readers will read it, because the screen reader can't read, can't see the image. So it'll be read aloud by the screen reader. It also will show up in place of your image if your image doesn't load. So if the image doesn't load, it'll just show the text. Yeah, question?
If your source is another link from another web page,
Mhm.
when you download the HTML once, does your servers save the image, or whenever someone wants to access your web page, do they download do they bring it up from that website each time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It'll pull it from your external web page each time. Your server doesn't really deal with it. The browser may cache it. The browser might save a copy of it, but yeah, it's going to make a network request to that separate web page. So you kind of have to be careful if you're using external, so this, linking to it on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is pretty safe because they're probably not going anywhere. They also provide a really generous license for using images, but also you want to consider the license of the image you're using. If you're pulling it from some website, it may be a copyrighted image that you don't have a right to show on your webpage, so you have to be really careful about that. Yeah, question?
Because Wikipedia is people go and change the content, isn't it kind of sketchy to use?
It's true. That is something to keep in mind, for sure. Because, yeah, they may change the URL, or they may replace the image with something else. So, yeah, that's a really good point. So if it disappears one day, you're not going to know until people start complaining that your website doesn't work because those images don't load anymore. So, yeah. Typically, especially for anything important, you want to download the image, include it in with your file, so it's a relative URL, not trust that external website. So yeah, really good point to bring up. You can even see, show an example, in the inspector, you can even see what all network requests are being made. So if we go to Wikipedia, I think there should be some images. Yeah, so like even here, if you open up the inspector and go to network, these are likely, then you have to reload the page. But you can see these are all of the requests being made, by the browser. So we see like the wikipedia.png, and you can see the domain these are being pulled from. So these are all being pulled from Wikipedia, but the browser's having to go load those images separately. So if it's they're external images, you'll see that those are from a different domain.
Does that mean that they're pulling them from database website, or like do they have this actual file?
Yeah, they have the actual file on the. It's still going to be a network request, but it's at least their same domain. So they have control over it, Whereas if it's an external domain, you don't have any control over it. Okay, so there's also a height and width attribute that we can use to set the size of the image in pixels. So this is really good to do. We can also do this with CSS, so we probably won't deal too much with the height and width attributes in our HTML. We'll do it in CSS. But images often take a lot longer to load than the rest of your web page. Your HTML downloads pretty quick. It's just, text. But, the images may be a couple megabytes. It may take a few seconds, to download them. So if you don't provide the height and width of your image, the browser won't leave any space for them. The browser doesn't know how big they are until it's done downloading them. So all of your content will just be squished with no extra space for those images. And then once those images load, then your browser jumps your page down and adds the space needed for those images. You may have noticed this, especially if you've ever been on a really slow connection. You'll load a page, you'll start reading it, and all of a sudden everything moves around, and it's because the images have loaded and it creates the space for them now. So if you provide the height and width, either as attributes or in your CSS, it will prevent that page jump because it actually saves the space for it while it loads. So it's really nice. It helps make sure your site looks good while it's loading your images. You should also make sure, especially if you're concerned about page speed, how fast your page loads, you really should resize your images to whatever size you're going to use. So say you have an image that's 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels, but you're only displaying it as 200 pixels by 200 pixels, you should resize it using a photo editor first, so that your browser doesn't have to download the full 1,000 pixels only to scrunch it and remove half of them anyway. So that's gonna help your site load a lot faster. I love whenever, just as freelance, sometimes I'll have clients come to be like, hey, our site's really slow, can you help? And I'm always like, yes, I can help you. And the first thing I do is I go through all their images, I resize them to the size they're actually shown on. I usually compress them a little bit more. I can drop their page load time from like 10, 15 seconds to usually 2 or 3 seconds just by getting the images the right size so they're not downloading unnecessarily large images. And then they're like, whoa, you're so brilliant. You made our site so much faster. I'm like, yes, you're welcome. All I did was resize your images in Photoshop. So you can become a hero if you know how to resize images. Pixlr is a good online editor if you don't have Photoshop. I think it's pixlr.com. It's basically Photoshop online. So you can resize images there as well. Another thing to talk about with images is image formats. So these are kind of the 3 main formats of images we'll use on the web. So PNG is really common. It supports transparency, which is its biggest plus. So you can have transparent parts of your image. Typically, it's going to be a little bit larger file sizes, a little bit higher quality as well. So PNG is good if you really care about what the image looks like. You want to make sure it looks as best as it can. PNG is kind of the best to use, but the trade-off is you're going to have a little bit larger file sizes. JPEG does not support transparency. It's best for like photographs or images with lots of different colors, and it can compress to smaller file sizes. So all of these are just different compression algorithms or different ways of compressing images, and running an algorithm across the image and combining pixels and making sure, it still looks good, but also reduces the amount of data used. So they each have their strengths and weaknesses, right? GIF, or GIF if you prefer, has the benefit of supporting animation, so you can have multiple frames and create animations. It has really limited transparency. You can do some like straight lines that are transparent, but typically your options are limited there. GIF is really good for illustrations or images with very few colors. Just the algorithm that it uses to compress, it does really well with straight lines, with single colors. You can take like a logo or something like that that's a really simple, illustration, and a GIF can compress it really well, just because the algorithm it uses is better at dealing with those types of images. Whereas JPEG is going to do a lot better, with a photograph, where every pixel is different. So like JPEG will do like averaging. So it'll like look at a cluster of pixels and it'll say, okay, what's the average color here? And then it'll create a new image that has the average. So it might take a 2,000 pixel by 2,000 pixel image and reduce it, and it's kind of averaging out the colors. Whereas GIF does a lot. If you do that with like a logo that has like white and then a solid line that's red, it might find an average that's like pink, right? Because it's like white and red are next to each other. So JPEG might cause some pink areas, because it's kind of averaging the white and the red at some point. Whereas GIF does really well at like finding edges of shapes and stuff, and then saying, okay, it's white up to here, and then it's red. So GIF is going to be what you're going to want to use for logos and stuff that need to look really crisp, whereas JPEG is good for photos. Or PNG is good for everything, as long as you're okay with it being larger file size. So if you really care about maintaining the quality, PNG is really good. Whereas JPEGs can get really small. Usually when you export a JPEG, you can even select the quality you want. So you can do like, by a percentage, you can say 80% quality, and it'll reduce the quality. So it'll do more averaging in order to save more space. So you can get images pretty small using JPEG. Okay, any questions about images before we move on to tables? We're on time. Okay, so HTML tables allow you to create a grid of cells, so think of like Excel or something like that, to display data or information. Tables should not be used for creating a page layout or like a sidebar or like navigation or like menus. When I learned HTML when I was in high school a long time ago, we did use tables for kind of doing the structure of our page. It's like, okay, create a cell here, make it this big, this is going to be your sidebar, that kind of thing. Because that's just how you did it back then. That was before CSS was quite as powerful. We had more limited options, so we use tables for everything. It's a really bad way to do it, because if you think about, you want your HTML to be your structure, not your style, not your layout. Tables should be for tabular data, any data that makes sense to use with tables. And it's really hard to do layouts using tables as well. You'll have a bad time if you do it that way. It's way easier to do it the proper way. So again, what tables should be used for is displaying data. Anything that, is actual data that can be formatted in a tabular format, use a table for that. How we do tables, we use a table element to create a table. TR is used for each row, stands for table row. TH will create a cell within a row that can be used for a heading. So I think by default they'll be bold and centered. So think of like the column heading or something like that. We'll use TH for that. Then TD will just create a normal cell within a row. A row can have multiple TD elements, which is how we create multiple columns. There's a couple of things we can do. The call span attribute will cause a cell to span multiple columns. So say you want a cell to span 2 columns. You can use call span equals 2, and it'll span those 2 columns. Also, we can do the same with row span and have a column or have a cell span multiple rows. Another thing to talk about, we have headings and footers that you can use. This is optional, but if your table makes sense, if you have a really clear header row or multiple rows that are all header information, or you have really clear footer rows, so maybe at the bottom of your table you have like a totals or something like that where you add up all of your rows. maybe you want to use the T-foot to wrap the footer. So this is inside of your table element. You'd have T-head for your header or T-body for the body, T-foot for the footer. It's not set any differently by default. It doesn't really do anything, but it can allow for some interaction, such as scrolling. Like if you have a really long table, but you don't want it to take up, a full page of your, website, you could say, okay, make the body 400 pixels tall and make it scroll. So the content inside would scroll. So it can have more content than may fit there, but you can scroll. That's stuff you would do with CSS or JavaScript. Or you might sort. You might want to sort like your body column or your body rows, but not your footer row, because the footer is the sum. It's always going to stay the same. You can use JavaScript to do some sorting on the rest. So again, they're optional, but they're kind of nice to have. So here's an example of creating a table. We've got our table element that wraps the whole thing. Here we've got our T-head, which again, we could remove and it doesn't really change anything. We've got our TR, which creates a row, and then 2 TDs. So we're going to have one row, and then each TD creates its own column. So, one thing to point out, we've then got our body and other rows here. If this row had 3 TDs, we'd have an extra column over here, and this third row would have data in it, but the rest wouldn't, because they don't have TDs there. So we'd have 3 columns here, but just 2 columns for these other 2 rows. So, and you can kind of change how that works. Sometimes it'll show empty cells up here. Sometimes it won't show up empty cells. There's a setting that you can use to change that in CSS, but that's generally how tables work. Any questions about tables? Again, if you need to use a table for something, I really recommend looking up tables, finding the reference, because again, I haven't even covered all the options. There's additional things we can do with tables, so I still, whenever I deal with tables, I have to look up, the reference on the Mozilla Developer Network, MDN, or even pull up the specification. It's a little hard to read usually, but find some reference that kind of goes through the options and kind of use that as a guide as you're making your table. Okay, before we finish up real quick, I want to show a couple of examples just to kind of illustrate a few things. Let's look at HTML introduction. I'll post this on Canvas too if you guys want to mess around with it. Okay, so here we have some HTML. We've got our head here, and I actually put a body tag, but there should be a body tag here as well. But so we've got our heading, we've got some text. One thing I wanted to show is like if you say, okay, I've got this paragraph, but I want some more space between this paragraph and this heading, and so you hit enter a couple times, and create some space over here. Your browser doesn't care. The HTML, it doesn't matter. It's not going to actually create that empty space for you. So the way we'll do that is with CSS. So we'll talk about that, when we get into CSS. One way you could do it would be using break tags. If we added, a couple of break tags, that's going to create that space. But again, that's not the right approach. So if you ever, have multiple break tags, you will make me very upset and disappointed, and probably take points off just because. So don't use multiple break tags. It's a bad thing to do. You could even we could have this heading right up next to this paragraph if we wanted to. It doesn't matter, right? Because your HTML just reads, okay, paragraph, oh, now heading, that gets a new line. So it puts a new line for your heading. Same goes for space within a paragraph. You could space out words. The browser doesn't care. It's not going to add that space for you. There's some other CSS ways we could do that if you really wanted to. So yeah, I think that's all I really wanted to show. I probably have a table demo. Yeah. I will look at some of these other HTML elements as well. So this one will show some of those elements we talked about. So here's an example of using ID. We'll talk more about ID later. Here we've got bold and italic. Here's how we would use like that superscript or the subscript, kind of makes it up above or below. Again, you might do that if you're writing some scientific stuff, but you might not otherwise. Here's what the block quote looks like with the site. So yeah, that's right here. Yeah, it's not really doing too much. It's not like doing anything when we hover. So yeah, that's more of a behind the scenes type of thing than providing that citation. Here's like abbreviation. So by default, this is Firefox. It kind of shows the abbreviation is kind of underlined here. So if we hover over it, it'll show whatever the title we gave it, in this case, hypertext markup language. So that can be kind of nice. Here's the definition. So again, Firefox is italicizing it. Then we provide the citation as well. Here's showing the address. Again, it doesn't really do anything by default. Actually, it italicized the address. If we get rid of this, it's probably going to unitalicize. Scroll back down. Yeah, so by default, italicizes address tags. I think Chrome doesn't. So again, that's kind of where you need to know the differences a little bit. Here's what our lists look like. Here's how we would nest a list. So we've got, a UL here with some list items, and then we've got an OL with some list items. So this OL is inside of this list item because we don't close this list item until after the OL. So that's how item 3 will have a sub list with additional steps. Show this table real fast. So here's kind of some examples how we'll do a table. So we've got like the 3. These are our THs for our headings. You notice here, you kind of have to mess around with it to get it to work how you want. Here I wanted a row heading and a column heading. So you notice, my full table here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns in it. And we'll see where the 5th one comes from in a second. But for these 4, to kind of create an empty cell up here, I had to just do a TB that's blank. So then I can have my Monday, Wednesday, Friday would show up in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th row or columns. Whereas, here in my 2nd row, I've got week 1 as a heading using TH. So week 1's the heading, and then 12, 14, and 15. So again, you may have to put some empty cells here and there to kind of get it to work how you want. And then like if we scroll down, we'll see this row right here has the 5 columns in it. It's got week 2, and then we've got 4 numbers. So that's where it added this extra cell. Even though the rest of these only have 4, because we have 5 columns here, it's added that extra one, and these are just blank. So that's kind of how column tables work. You just kind of have to mess around with it. Here's an example of using call span. So like if this is a schedule, geography here spans 2 columns. So you'll notice geography spans both the 9 and the 10. Same here with science, takes up 3. So that's kind of how that works. Here's an example of using like the T head and the T body. So we've got our T head, which contains 2 heading cells with student and grade. So let me scroll down any more. But then like maybe we use T foot for the average. So it's different data. Like the T body contains our data that's like student grade. Like that's our data. The heading, is different. It's a label, and then our footer is different as well. It's a label and then an average. So that's where it kind of makes sense to break those up into different sections, so it's pretty clear which is a heading, which is the body of our data. Okay, I put the new assignment up on Slack. So the second assignment, it's creating, using all of these HTML tags we've learned so far to create a personal bio page, or it can be like a celebrity or someone, whatever you want, your dog or something. So there's requirements in the assignment of what tags you need to use. So you need to use a lot of these. So Fill out whatever information makes sense to add. I think I said due next Thursday.